Hey guys, Thomas here with Cars and Caffeine. Today I wanted to do something a little different, and we're actually going to talk about a topic that seems to cause a lot of confusion with people. As you can obviously tell by the video title, we're going to take a little look into leasing today and talk about some frequently asked questions and some areas of confusion with leasing, and hopefully we can answer some questions for you and help you decide if leasing a new car is right for you. So let's head down to the parking garage and go for a little drive while we talk about leasing.
So I think probably the most common question is, should I lease or buy my new car? And that's something I definitely want to address in this video, but the reality is that's a complicated question, as there's many different factors that play into determining whether a lease or a purchase might be better in your situation. So we're going to actually start this video by talking about some of the other features and key differences between leasing and buying, and then hopefully that'll help us determine whether or not leasing or buying would be better for you in your specific situation. So one of the key main features right away is, can you lease a used car? For the most part, no. I mean, 9 times out of 10 you're not going to be able to lease a used car. There are a few rare situations where some dealers will let you lease like a used luxury car, a very expensive car. But for the most part, no, you can't lease a used car. And that's mainly just because the terms of the lease are determined based on like the depreciation of the vehicle, and it's just more simple and more standard practice to be able to determine the depreciation of a vehicle in the first like 3 or 4 years of purchase, as well as manufacturer warranties will all be in effect within that time period, which also help out with leases. So another common question is, why are there mileage limits, or like why is the mileage you drive affect your lease? So oftentimes you'll see lease terms coming in and you'll be like, you can do a 10,000 mile a year lease, or 12 or 15,000 mile a year. Those three are the most common amounts of mileage you can do on a lease. So why are there limits, and what happens if you go over or under? Simply put, the mileage is used to determine the value of the vehicle at the end of the lease. So if you do an average lease of like 12,000 miles a year, and that means that at the end of 3 years, so you just do a 3-year lease, which is a common lease, they're figuring that you're going to put 36,000 miles on the brand new car. So they're going to estimate the value of the car at that point being 3 years old and having 36,000 miles. And then they use that value and the difference between that value and the original like MSRP of the car to determine how much you have to pay over the course of the lease. Because when you're leasing, you're not buying the car, you're using the car for a set period of time for a set amount of miles, and then you pay back the dealership the depreciation that you put on the car, and then at the end of the lease, the dealership gets the car back. So that's why the mileage that you select for your lease will determine kind of how much you're paying in the lease. However, there's not usually a huge difference between like a 10,000 mile a year lease and like a 12,000 mile a year lease. I mean, it's going to be, $10 a month or something like that. It's not going to be a huge difference, because that's not going to have a huge impact on the depreciation of the vehicle. So one thing to note there right away off the bat is, if you're someone who puts 20,000 miles a year on your car because you do a lot of road trips or something like that, a lease is not going to be a smart choice for you, because leases are meant for low mileage people. That's just how the contracts are set up and how they work most efficiently, because the dealer wants to get the car back in good condition, still under warranty, and all those kind of things at the end of the lease. So if you're putting 20,000 miles a year or more, you're definitely going to want to be buying a car versus leasing a car. So what happens if you go over or under on those miles? Well, if you go under, it doesn't really matter, other than the dealership wins, I guess. So let's say you're doing 12,000 miles a year for 3 years again, just continue with our example. But at the end of 3 years, let's say you only put like 20,000 miles on the car for some reason instead of 36,000. Really, it's not going to matter, other than the fact that the car has 16,000 miles less than expected. So the car might actually be worth more than what the lease assumed the car would be worth. So in that case, you might actually build some equity in the car, meaning that the car is worth more than what the contract figures it would be, which may be useful when you then go to turn in the lease. So we'll get back to that in a second, but I just want to talk quickly about what happens if you go over in mileage. In most contracts, if you go over in mileage, you're going to have to pay a flat rate per mile. So you might have to pay, so many cents per mile that you go over. And that amount that they figure is usually the same, not always, but usually it's the same as, like, if you look at the difference in cost between 10,000 miles a year and 12,000 miles a year, and you divide that, into 2,000 miles to get the price per mile, it's usually that same amount, or at least very close to it. So you're not really like overly penalized for going over. It's just, it's kind of like a equal payment. So if you choose like a 10,000 mile a year lease, but you end up putting 12,000 miles a year on it, you're probably going to pay about the same as if you had selected 12,000 miles a year from the start, if that makes sense. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense about why leases have different mileage on them and how that affects the cost. So now we'll get back to another common question, or at least a common criticism of leases, is that you're never going to build equity in a lease, which for the most part is true. Because a lease, you're not buying the car, it's not the best comparison, but you can kind of compare it to like renting versus buying. In leasing, you're kind of like renting the car, and then the way you determine your rent is based on how many miles you can put on the car and how many years you're going to rent it, and then they calculate the depreciation of what they expect it to cost, and then you're simply just paying the dealer back the amount of depreciation you put on the car, and then when you're done with the lease, you give the car back to the dealership, so then they can sell it as a used car, and they've been paid for the depreciation. So that's essentially how it works. There's also other like fees associated with the contract too, so it's not like you're paying just the depreciation, nothing else. There are other fees and things like that in the contract, so that's something, look at the contract and talk to the finance people at the dealership about too, because that's where you can end up paying a lot more than what maybe you need to be based on how the terms of the contract are set up. But that's definitely something we can address in a different video, and that's something that interests you guys as well. But back to the part of equity. So yeah, you're not going to build equity in like the classic sense of the term. Because if you buy a car, you're essentially guaranteed to have equity at some point. Because let's say you buy a car and you finance it out over 6 years, or 5 years. Let's say 5 years. So it's a 60-month financing program, which is pretty common. So you're paying it off over 5 years. So at the end of 5 years, you're going to owe nothing on your car. You will have no more car payment. So as long as your car is still worth, something, worth, $100 or something at the end of 5 years, you still have equity in the car because it's worth more than what you owe. So if you finance a car, you are almost guaranteed to have equity at some point. In most situations, you're going to have equity in a few years, probably. The depreciation is obviously a lot higher in the first few years of buying a car, and then the curve of the depreciation decreases as you go. So right when you walk out the dealership, you're not going to have equity. You're going to owe more than what your car is worth. But then hopefully in a few years' time, it should be about even, and then maybe 4 years in, 4 years in, you will hopefully have equity again in the car. So how does that compare with leasing? Obviously, as we talked about, you can't really build equity, but I did mention if you're way under a mileage, you might actually have some equity in the contract itself, because the contract is figuring the car to be worth X number of dollars at the end, but you're way under a mileage, so you're actually going to be worth more than that predetermined amount, most likely. But the thing is, here, the dealership probably isn't going to tell you that, because the dealership doesn't want you to know that you might have equity in the car, because most people who do a lease don't realize you can ever have equity in a car, and it's not a very common situation. But this gets us to kind of another point about leases too, is that you can turn in a lease anywhere. You don't have to go to the dealership that you bought or leased the car from and give the car back to them at the end. You can take your contract and turn it in anywhere. So you can find a dealership, like especially right now, while used cars are selling like crazy right now. The used car market's doing very well right now. So you can take that contract that you have and when your lease is up, and you can kind of shop around too, because you might find a dealership that will give you some money towards your next car, whether that be a lease or a purchase, helping out with down payment or something. They might give you some kind of incentive towards your next car because they really want your used car on their lot. As well as, if you're under on mileage, you can shop around and find a dealership that's going to help reward you for that kind of equity you would have in your contract for being way under in mileage. So that's something that I would encourage people to do if they're turning in a lease right now, is definitely go around to some different dealerships and see if they're going to give you anything or any kind of incentive, because used cars are in demand right now, at least where we're from in this area. The cars are definitely in demand right now, so you might have some bargaining power there, which, because a lot of people criticize leases for not having any kind of bargaining power because you don't own the car, but you do kind of have the contract, because you don't have to go back to that dealership at the end of the lease with your contract. You can go to any dealership, so you still have a little bit of bargaining power, if that makes sense. So as you can tell, there's a lot of factors that play into determining whether or not a lease is right for you, and it's not a simple question, absolutely. And I'd just like to quickly kind of summarize some of these points that we've made here through this video, and then we'll kind of address, is a lease right for you? So advantages of leases are, your monthly payment is usually going to be a little bit lower than if you had bought it, or if you had financed the car, because you're just paying the depreciation over 3 years rather than paying the full price of the car over 5 years, for example. So your monthly payment will usually be a little bit lower, which the downside to that is you're usually not building equity in the car when you're doing a lease. A positive side is if you don't drive the car very much, or you're pretty low on miles every year, a lease might be more advantageous because it does cost less per month than if you finance a car, whereas financing would be more beneficial for you, or buying it outright, if you put in a lot of miles per year, because leases are not structured to work well with high mileage cars. Another advantage of leasing is that your vehicle will always be under the manufacturer warranty. So if something goes wrong with the vehicle, it's going to be under warranty. So if you're someone who is not comfortable working on cars, or is just scared of having to fix something on a car if it goes out and having to face that bill, or you're worried about having to deal with mechanics and that kind of thing, a lease might be a good option for you because you're always going to be under that manufacturer warranty. Whereas with financing a car, a disadvantage might be that if you're going to probably keep it for a longer period of time so that you build the equity in the car, since that's the main advantage of financing versus leasing. So you're probably going to have it for a longer period of time, so something's more likely to go wrong on the car, so you want to pay more attention to picking out a reliable car if you do that. Another pro of leasing is it's easier to get into a newer vehicle more often than if you are financing, simply because if you're financing, you need to wait till you have equity in a car before you can move to a new car, at least for it to make financial sense. Also, with financing a car, you're going to be required or responsible for coming up with a down payment, where with leasing, you can usually negotiate it so that you don't need anything up front other than the first month's payment and maybe some fees associated with the contract. So with those points in mind, who would be a good example of someone that could lease a vehicle and have it make sense for them? In some situations, buying someone a first car, it might make sense to lease it for them, because you're able to get a nicer car for the same monthly payment as if you were to buy it. Simply just trying to say that the lease payment is going to be lower, as well as it's always going to be under warranty for them, so they don't have to worry about maintaining it. And if it's their first car, the odds are they aren't going to be putting a ton of miles on it, so you can get pretty low mileage lease. You can get pretty decent, reliable, safe car for your son or daughter and not have to pay a huge amount for it, really, if you get low mileage lease. And at the end of 3 years, you can turn it in, and then you can readdress at that point. Okay, so maybe we'll buy them a used car now, or we'll readdress it at that point. But it might be a good way to kind of start them out with a car, with it being nice, brand new, safe, reliable. You can shop around, get whatever car you want, and not have to worry about buying a used car, worry about the safety or the reliability of it. So that's always a good option there. Another person that would be good to lease a car is someone who is self-employed, because if you're self-employed, you can tax deduct your car payment as a business expense when you're leasing the car. So that's always a nice option or a nice thing to keep in mind too, is for your business you can buy a good car. And I mean, obviously if you're self-employed, appearance is everything too. I mean, it's very important to keep up appearances because people have to trust you. You're the face of the business, so you need to have, in most situations, I'd imagine you need to have a nice looking car, whether that be, you know, a truck because you're an independent contractor or an architect, a building company, something like that, or a nice looking car because you're self-employed in finance, you're a CPA, something like that. I mean, you want to make that good impression too, so being able to lease a car and tax deduct it as a business expense is a good option as well. But also remember, if you're self-employed, you might be putting more miles on too. Who knows, you might be traveling, so you got to weigh that as well, that you want to stay low mileage if you're going to lease. Otherwise, the tax deduction might not be worth it. If you're going to have to put so many miles on the car, the cost is probably not going to be worth it in the end. So someone who should not lease a car would be someone who's going to put a lot of miles on the car. Simply put, if you put a lot of miles on your car, a lease just is not going to be structured to work for you. Also with leasing a car, you got to keep in mind that you're kind of locked into the car, because at least if you finance or buy a car, you can always turn around and sell it. Now you may have to sell it at a loss if you're really in a pinch for money or something like that. That's true, but in most situations you can sell your car if you need to, and you always have that option, which is kind of a nice peace of mind for some people, or depending on your situation that might be important to you. Or if you're going to lease, you can't just like sell your car. Like really the main way out of a lease would be to buy it out, which obviously is not going to generate you any money, but you got to remember with a lease, you're not buying the car. I mean, it's kind of like the renting analogy again. So keep that in mind too. If you lease a car, I mean, you're committing to it. I mean, and anytime you make a big financial decision or purchase, you should obviously be committing to it, but just really keep that in mind. I mean, if something goes south with a lease, it's not as easy to get out of as if you had bought the car. So I guess just kind of for a conclusion for this video, there's obviously a lot of factors that play into this. So I hope this video has kind of helped you at least realize all the different factors, as well as maybe helps you decide, you know, what might be a good option for you. And if you have any more questions that we didn't cover on this video, certainly leave a comment and we'll try to get back to you on those. Obviously there's many factors that play into this, and there's many more features of leasing and financing that I was able to cover in this video. So I just wanted to kind of keep it shorter and just cover the main points that are important to cover, or the controversial ones, as well as the ones that people might not fully understand or be aware of. So hopefully I did a good job covering that for you guys. And if you're new to our channel, I invite you to check out the rest of our videos, and as well as subscribe for more. Hopefully you'd like this video, so please feel free to drop a like and share this video with someone who might find it of interest, or find it useful. So just hoping to help you guys out, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks. Have a great day.